Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Jawan Johnson. I've had the awesome pleasure of meeting many of you today and interacting. I'm the Mellon Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow with the Lemon Project. And tonight I have the pleasure of introducing a dynamic scholar whom we heard about earlier today in our opening plenary that was guided by Dr. Jamel Donner, who used the text, The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. And he put forth several thoughts there that have really, and many of the thoughts that he put forth have carried, the themes have carried throughout our discussions, through the various panelists that we've heard from today that are who centered the lives and the humanity of Black men. And so tonight, we're going to hear from the author of this wonderful text and who is the author of many books that I'll later discuss. But Dr. Tommy Curry is a scholar, of course, author, professor of philosophy, and as of 2019 holds a personal chair in Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh. He is the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, which won the 2018 American Book Award. He is the author of Another White Man's Burden, Josiah Royce's Quest for a Philosophy of Racial Empire, and has republished The Forgotten Philosophical Works of William Ferris as the Philosophical Treatise of the Evolution in Western Civilization. He is also the editor of the first book series dedicated to the study of Black males entitled Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males on Temple University Press. Dr. Curry is currently co-editing with Dawnae Evans the forthcoming anthology, Contemporary African American Philosophy, Where Do We Go From Here? Dr. Curry's research has been recognized by Diverse as placing him among the top 15 emerging scholars in the United States in 2018, and his public intellectual work earned him the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy's Alan Locke Award in 2017. He is a past recipient of the USC Shoah Foundation and the AI and Manette Sheps Foundation Teaching Fellowship as of 2017. He is also the past president of Philosophy Born of Struggle, one of the oldest Black philosophy organizations in the United States of America. So let's welcome our esteemed speaker for the hour, Dr. Tommy Curry. Let's give him an applause as he comes.
First, thank you so much for the invitation. To check the clicker? Or is it just?
So we should
Just click on it?
yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Excellent. So the introduction to Black male studies is something that's very dear and close to my heart. When I began writing the book, The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, I was told that it would cost me my career. That to study Black men outside of the popular paradigms of intersectionality and Black feminism, by making Black men agentic, by studying them on the basis of scientific evidence and their own stories phenomenologically, that simply could not fly in the academy. When I was given a lecture at Black Academics a few years back, I happened to mention this quote: "While we may disown the racist caricature of Black men and boys as super predators, we simultaneously imagine them as voids, vacuous figures that we are fine not knowing. We do not care about how they suffer during their lives, but we love performing outrage at their deaths." One of the major methodological problems we have in the academy is that we do not have positive theories of Black men. Black men become studied when they become problems, when they harm someone, or they pose a threat to the society at large. Our accounts of their lives, how they suffer, how they create positive value, how they experience love, how they experience fear, what they wish to be. Can a Black boy actually want to be a Black man given the negative stereotypes in America? These are the foundational questions that Black male studies attempts to answer. Now, Black men have been demonized in the United States basically since its inception. In 1865, with the ending of the Civil War to 1890, post-bellum ethnologists who were influenced by evolutionary theory claimed that free Black men were a threat to the Republic. that they were no better than beasts, and they were genetically and biologically predisposed to raping women. 1868 to 1910 was no better. With the expansion of women's rights and the push for suffragism, gender, or the idea of the difference between men and women, black men still remain beasts, but this political movement claimed that black men were evolutionarily behind the white race. Because ethnology was a science that evaluated the stages of racial development based on men, black men became a central target for 100 years in the construction of racial inferiority. From 1910 to 1930, sexologists argued that black males were apatriarchal and savage. They were not really men. This is where I get the title, "The Man Not" from. So in order to control them, to control their deviance, to control their sexual lust, they needed to be either lynched or castrated. So at the turn of the century in America, we argued that the more humane and progressive alternative to solving the black male problem was castration. From the 1930s to the 1960s, black males were depicted as lesser men, prone to deviance and female personality disorders. Because they couldn't lead families and be actual husbands and fathers, they were thought to belong to the streets, that they did not have a natural residence in their own homes. And because of this, their sons were meant to suffer, being raised and socialized by their mothers. White social sciences depict this as hypermasculinity, or the inability of black men to have any positive role concept of their own ideas about what it means to be a black male. In the 1970s, these ideas, these racist pathologies that thought black families were dysfunctional, were used to say that black men were culturally deficient, violent, and prone to interracial rape. Subculture violence theory served as the basis of our modern concept of gender studies. So throughout the 19th and early 20th century, ethnology was the predominant science of racial origin and evolution. This means that most of the writings we have in English about racial inferiority were based on constructing the inferiority of black men and boys as the basis of keeping the whole race subjugated. So ethnology was a scientific inquiry that assessed the evolutionary stage and ultimate ends of races by comparing the males of the white group to that of black and non-Western peoples. So this research was used by white pseudoscientists and feminists to depict black men as lesser evolved males who were not men, who were savage, and did not actually deserve to be present in America beyond the stage of enslavement. So this idea of an apatriarchal black man was used to situate the failures of the whole race from the 1900s forward. These racist pathological accounts of the black family, its inability to rise within America, was situated on black males not actually being men. So this brings us to the 1970s. And I want to focus on this moment because it really does impact how black male studies conceptualizes the intellectual and academic liberation of the study of black males. In the 1960s, subcultural violence theory was introduced as a formulation to suggest that violence was the mainstay value of oppressed populations. Unlike the dominant group, who understood and could interact through civility, black people were thought to communicate through violence. The effect of this was that the apatriarchal and weak position of the black male was theorized as the reason for black women perpetrating higher levels of intimate partner homicide against males, more so than other races, and tried to distort what we think of as our modern concept of gender. Take a moment to engage Farrakouti and Wolfgang's quote here. They suggest that physical aggression was often seen as a demonstration of masculinity and toughness. This idea is not uncommon to us, given what we learn today from toxic masculinity. But they ask this question: if homicide's any index at all of physical aggression, then we must remember that in the Philadelphia data, non-white females have rates often 2 to 4 times higher than the rates of white males. So violent behavior appears more dependent on cultural differences than sex differences, traditionally considered of paramount importance in the expression of aggression. So the Negro female then both endures and suffers more of the male role as head of household, as parental authority and supervisor. Then this imposed role makes her more aggressive, more male-like, more willing, and more likely to respond violently. Now this quote is important because it suggests that gender differences in the white race between white men and white women were only racial differences in the black race. The black race was naturally more violent. So a weaker male, an apatriarchal male, who was not present in the home, who was not a real man, was assumed to be dominated by his female counterpart. Now, these racist theories have no basis in empiricism. These are racist white theorists that are trying to make an example of the black American case, because what they see is a distortion of American gender hierarchies. But they didn't stop at homicide. The next stage was to make an argument about how rape could also be explained by this racial pathology. Their student Maketh wrote that black masculinity was created as a pathological category. He says, quote, "The Negro male's aggressive sexuality seems to be more problematically due to the strong need to overcome problems of masculinity and of sexual identity. This is so because of the Negro family structure, which is mother-based, and the need to overcome general social disadvantages by substituting sexual aggressive masculinity for failures as a man in the economic and social status spheres," end quote. Now, this subculture of violence theory introduces an analytic to how we think of academic studies today. Maketh introduced the idea that you can study black masculinity as a pathological entity, as something that because of its lack, because of its denial and suffering politically and economically, because of its oppressed status, was actually a danger to all those around it. And this is important because when we start thinking about how disciplines allow us to engage with certain populations, we don't often ask the question of where the theories themselves come from. Subculture of violence theory created the basis of how we actually think about black male sexual perpetration, and was the foundation of what we take to be black masculinity. Amir continued that the Negro subculture is historically unique because it embodies all the characteristics of lower class subculture, but has some more pronounced and unique features. The Negro subculture is characterized by revolving of life around some basic focal concerns, and includes a search for thrills through aggressive actions and sexual exploits. So the emphasis is given by males to masculinity, and their need to display and defend it through brief and transitory relations with women. Such needs and the subsequent concerns which sex stems from growing up in a family in which the mother is dominant and the father has a marginal position. So young boys are imbued with negative or at least ambivalent feelings towards masculine functions. Sexual and aggressive behavior becomes the main vehicle for asserting their worthiness. They therefore idealize personal violence and prowess, which substitute for social and economic advantages. So subculture violence theory suggested that black men and boys were being socialized because of their race into pathological forms of aggression. This history implicated black women as well, not only as perpetrators of violence within the home, but as transmitters of this violence to young black boys. So white social sciences in the era before the founding of gender studies in the 70s suggested to us that our notions of black masculinity had to respect the fear that they caused in the society. And this is how academics started founding what we take black men and boys to be. So gender theory has a real hold then in subcultural violence theory, specifically its development of compensatory masculinity. The social ostracization and oppression of black men and boys in the United States gave rise to an idea that the lack of true masculinity, of true manhood amongst black men, was in fact responsible for their deviant status. Criminology introduced compensatory masculinity and hypermasculinity as the mainstay of how we interpret and study the lives of black men and boys. So the work of subculture violence theorists introduced the idea that black men were a uniquely violent racial subgroup that used intraracial rape, sexual aggression, and violence as their definition of masculinity. Now, following the publication of Amir's 1971 study, white criminologists started to focus on the threat that black males pose to women and children within their group. So we always hear the myth of the black rapist, the threat that black men pose to white women. But what we do not understand is the social scientific basis of studying black masculinity actually gave rise to the intraracial rapist. And this shift towards intraracial violence and victimization allowed white social scientists to claim that higher rates of deviance amongst black males proved they were in fact an unassimilatable group in the United States. So compensatory masculinity and hypermasculinity actually separated black men from black women within the spheres of violence by making masculinity the cause of black pathology and deviance. Lynn A. Curtis created a three-dimensional model of what he meant by this. You see, we tend to think that the intersectional nature of how we analyze problems are naturally progressive. We assume that if we make distinctions between race, class, and gender, that only leads us toward liberatory politics. But if we study the era right before the rise of black feminist epistemology, we see that the study of race, class, and gender was actually used to speciate poor black males from the general tendency of violence of the rest of the race. Lynn A. Curtis suggests that as black poverty increased, young poor black males increased their rates of violence. The contracultural notion was that these young poor black men that were deprived of social, political, and economic opportunities internalized that deficit, and they compensated through the harm of others. So Lynn A. Curtis, because he was a criminologist and was directing federal criminal policy and housing acts, suggested that America had to target black men, not only through social policy, but through academic work. That we had to demonize, that we had to alert the world to the dangers these poor young black men pose to our civil society. And it's in this speciation, the violent nature of the black male, that gender actually starts to matter within the context of the black cultural sphere. So Curtis argued that poor black males actually overindulge in white cultural practices. With a limited number of avenues open, it's but a short theoretical step to think that some blacks have concentrated such expressions more than an acceptable in the dominant culture, so that a more distinguishable cluster highlighted by physical toughness, sexual exploitation emerges among some poor black males than among middle-class black or white males. The credibility of this process heightens when the quality of youth is added to blackness, maleness, and poverty. In certain ways, adaptive physical embellishments beyond subcultural patterns can be interpreted as coalitions of body and mind at the crest of energy and exploratory inquisitiveness. So one of the ways that this became highlighted in American social policy is the debates that Lynn A. Curtis was having with white American feminists over the question of rape. Now, during this period of time, white American feminists were making the connection between sexism, patriarchy, and rape as a mechanism of power and social hierarchy. But Curtis, in arguing with Susan Griffin, suggests while feminists had one part right, was that there was a relationship between patriarchy and rape, what they forgot to consider is the racial element. That when you look at black men, the unique subculture of pathology suggested that higher rates of rape was due to the fact that they were in fact emulating white men, distorting the values of male-led societies and dominance, and creating even more virulent forms of male privilege that were unseen in the white race. These notions and debates that Lynn A. Curtis is having with Susan Griffin inspired whole generations of feminists to then adopt gender and subcultural violence theory as the basis of the gender analytic. So feminist applications of subcultural violence theory to some may seem antithetical. We largely think that feminism is a progressive movement that's trying to expand liberal rights for a group that's largely been oppressed because of their womanhood. However, in mainstay feminist theory, Susan Brown Miller introduced Wolfgang's subcultural violence theory as the basis of understanding American masculinity. She writes, Wolfgang's theory, and I must oversimplify, is that within the dominant value system of our culture, there exists a subculture formed from those lower classes, the poor, the disenfranchised, the black, whose values often run counter to those of the dominant culture, the people in charge. The dominant culture can operate within the laws of civility because it has little need to resort to violence to get what it wants. But the subculture, thwarted, inarticulate, and angry, is quick to resort to violence. Indeed, violence and physical aggression become a common way of life, particularly for young males. Now, what Brown Miller's work did was introduce the idea of subcultural violence theory linking masculinity to sexual violence. Said differently, the gender analytic in the United States developed not on the basis of observable sexual inequalities between men and women generally, but also alongside criminological accounts of black men that were thought to pose a threat to the civil order of American society. So rather than an analytic that is trying to capture objective states of reality, the analytic was also meant to do political work in convincing America that its policies, sanctions, and racial order were in fact legitimate and necessary to prevent black men from engaging and encountering white women and other black women as well. She writes, we're not talking about Jean Valjean who stole a loaf of bread in Les Miserables, but about physical aggression as a demonstration of masculinity and toughness, right? We've heard this before, right? A phrase of Wolfgang's, the primary tenet of the subculture of violence. Or to use a current phrase, the machismo factor. Allegiance or conformity to machismo, particularly in a group or gang, is a sine qua non of status, reputation, and identity for low-class male youth. So sexual aggression, of course, is a major part of machismo. The single most important contribution of Amir's Philadelphia study was to place the rapist squarely within the subculture of violence. The rapist, it was revealed, had no separate identifiable pathology aside from the individual quirks and personality disturbances that might characterize any single offender who commits any sort of crime. So this idea that masculinity was in fact a universal characteristic that was distorted by black men became the basis of racial sexual stratification theory. It was the idea that even though black people were subcultural, even though black people did not have the values of the dominant white society, through the violence and the violent act of rape, black men sought to imitate white men. Black men sought to imitate some distorted form of patriarchy. And ultimately, black men, like white men, sought to harm women. Now, what's interesting about Williams and Holmes' study in 1981 is it is the first account given in the sociological literature to even suggest that gender differences amongst racial groups imitate the dominant patterns of the dominant group. So what happened in the white race would also happen in the racial or ethnic groups as well. So interracial rape became the basis of interpreting black male patriarchy. Williams and Holmes suggested that black females, in comparison with Anglos and Mexican Americans, are disproportionately victims of rape and all too aware of their vulnerability. In the black community, tension and ambivalence surround the topic of rape. The system of racial sexual stratification has assigned black females to be victims and black males to victimize. Black females are victimized in convergence of racism and sexism by both black and white males. For black males, rape is a tool of oppression, whether couched in the myth of the black stud or the black rapist. This discussion of blacks and their experience in relation to rape is intended to demonstrate the rape risks are inherent in the black experience, end quote. And it's so important for us to actually understand what this literature does. This literature situates rape and sexual aggression as the basis of black masculinity. It does not simply argue or accuse black men of being rapists. It suggests that black masculinity develops because of the acts of aggression and rape, and that our culture, black culture, is situated on this threat and fear of violence. So racial sexualization depends on contracultural violence. It depends on the idea that rape is deliberately undertaken by poor subcultural groups of males to intimidate and control women in their population. Holmes and Williams continue that rape or the threat of rape is the most important tool of social control in a complex system of racial sexual stratification. In a racially and sexually stratified society, a high incidence of rape is predictable. Rape symbolizes not only a key element of social control working to maintain the system, but also the anger and violence engendered by the system, right? That's that lack, that black men are oppressed, that their anger, that their frustration then becomes sexual aggression against others. There's a further projection of the white male patriarchy in rape. In raping minority women, Williams and Holmes claims, minority males frequently are doing no more than imitating the white male. As Curtis suggests, black on black rape is a symbolic expression of the white male hierarchy. So compensatory masculinity and mimesis became a core assumption of gender studies. It's from subcultural violence theory and criminology that we're starting to formulate what black masculinity and the study of black masculinity actually is in American colleges and universities during this period of time. So Williams and Holmes asserted that the male sex organ became the identity of the black male as well as his tenuous link with life itself. Shulamith Firestone in 1970 claimed that the relationship between the black man and the white man duplicates the relationship of the male child to the father. We have seen how at a certain point, in order to assert his ego, the child must transfer his identification from the female, which is powerless, to the male, which is powerful. But despite the fact that Williams and Holmes admit that there is no empirical evidence, nor is there any empirical validation for either the myth of black male sexuality are that of sex as a compensatory behavior. These have become the core tenets of Black masculinity theory in our contemporary time and disciplines. But it didn't end with white feminism. Some Black feminists were influenced by the work of Brown Miller and Williams and Holmes. Bell Hooks was one of those authors. In her book, We Real Cool, she actually argues that many Black males explain their decision to become the beast as a surrender to these realities they can't change. And if you're going to be seen as a beast, you might as well act like one. So young Black males, notice the descriptors there, like Susan Brown Miller, young Black males, particularly poor, underclass males, often derive a sense of satisfaction from being able to create fear in others, particularly white folks. So showing aggression is the simplest way to assert patriarchal manhood. Now, Hooks understands the violence of poor minority men through this idea of rape, very similar to Menachem Amir. It's important to understand here that what we're dealing with in our interpretation of the lives of Black men is not simply political ideology, but the development of a certain history of ideas, where notions of pathology from ethnology in the 19th century developed sociologically and then criminologically to find its apex in gender theory. The gender analytic itself demands that we understand Black masculinity as a reaction against the negative social forces that we find in society. So the more oppressed that we understand the Black male to be, we simultaneously imagine him to respond to that oppression as a mechanism of anger, violence, and social deviance. Hooks says that if we consider the case of the Central Park Five, by combining feminist analysis of race and masculinity, one sees that since male power within patriarchy is relative, the men from poorer groups and men of color are not able to reap the material and social rewards for their participation in patriarchy. So no one can truly believe that young Black males involved in the Central Park incident were not engaged in a suicidal ritual and enactment of a dangerous masculinity that will ultimately threaten their lives and their well-being. Citing Dyson, she suggests that Black men are nihilistic, that they're despairing, and that these conditions that are produced by the oppressive circumstances of America actually find its ultimate expression in violence towards others. She ends by saying it's rather naive to think that if Black men don't value their lives, that they will value the lives of others. Is it really so difficult for folks to see the connection between the constant pornographic glorification of male violence against women that is represented, enacted, and condoned daily in the culture and the Central Park Five? Well, fortunately, these young men were innocent. But the interpretive framework that we use to understand them, to contemplate whether or not they were innocent or guilty, appealed to some of the most atrocious criminological theories that we've known in the 20th century. And this is the danger of not having a liberatory epistemology, a study that starts from the construction of Black men as sociological, not ontological products of their environment. We have to break with the idea that gender theory explains something before we actually start studying it. It's the intuitions that are guiding Hooks. It's the intuitions that have been solidified by centuries of pathological thinking and deficit models that do not allow us to accept that Black men can in fact be victims of other forms of violence besides for racism. But what's even more disparaging is that our contemporary intersectional theories actually draw from this literature. Now, for most people, Kimberly Crenshaw's theories of intersectionality indicate progressiveness and complexity of our social circumstance. But she does, in fact, cite and utilize Williams and Holmes' quotes about intraracial rape as a way to talk about the drives for oppression and social organization that we find ultimately tend towards the explanatory theory of rape by Black men. So contemporary accounts of Black masculinity tend to emphasize intraracial dynamics of control and violence against Black women, children, and sexual minorities, and the emulation or mimesis of white masculinity. Frank Rudy Cooper's article Against Bipolar Masculinity is an example of this. And ethnographic interpretations of Black male life focus on violence as the core defining aspect of Black men and boys' socialization. So when we study Black men, when we try to interpret their experiences, as Gail Garfield did in her work, the lens that frames those experiences tend to be that masculinity or black masculinity tends towards violence. So we put black men and boys in proximity to violence, them committing violence, right, as the basis and the starting point of all of our investigations, with little regard for how black men suffer from their sexual victimization and vulnerability as males. Black men in the United States experience higher rates of intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide than many other race-sex groups. When we're looking at 12-month prevalence of context sexual violence, physical violence and stalking by intimate partners for black men, 11.6% is higher than that of black women or white women in the United States. Despite this prevalence, black men have historically experienced some of the most atrocious rates of interracial violence, but because we over-determine them as perpetrators, we never track how they may actually suffer in their homes, neighborhoods, schools, or other environments. Intimate partner homicide from 1976 to 1990 was the highest amongst black men. Right? In some years, it was comparable even to the rates of white women in America. But guess which group never gets mentioned as a victim? Now, this is certainly not to decenter the large problem that we have of domestic violence and child abuse in our communities. But it is to suggest to us that the narrow lens of gender, which has only looked at black men as perpetrators and not victims of this kind of violence, has to be questioned with evidentiary support and basis. When you look at the rates of intimate partner homicide, both from the 2000 Bureau of Justice Statistics Special Report and the FBI supplement of 1998, we can see very clearly that while there's a downward trend of homicide in the black race, black men up to around 91, 92 still were the majority of the victims. We have absolutely no explanation for this. Over the last 30 or 40 years, no one's cared to ask why. This means that when we were developing these subculture violence theories, we were making arguments about patriarchy causing intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide. The deaths of black men in domestic situations were completely ignored. And we see the same thing per 100,000 in the rates. So ask yourself this question. When we say that we love to perform outrage at the murders and deaths of black men and boys, but we rarely care for their lives, how is it that so much evidence tells us that black men suffer in so many different ways, yet we've never asked the question of what do we do about it? And it's that evidentiary contradiction with theory that forces us to start digging deeper into how we start problematizing the experiences of black men within their own communities and in terms of how they define themselves. When we look at lifetime and 12-month prevalence rates of black women, we completely accept and see that there are disproportionate rates of both lifetime and 12-month prevalence compared to their white counterparts. Social determinants like poverty, segregation, previous exposure to trauma, recidivism, alcoholism, all these things are well documented in the field to talk about why higher rates of intimate partner violence amongst black people, poor people, Hispanic peoples, etc., actually exists. But when we see the same disproportionate rates amongst groups of black men, we have zero answers, zero studies, and zero questions. So while we see 12-month prevalence being 11.6%, we see a lifetime prevalence of 40%, we've never asked, well, what happens to these victims? How are black men experiencing themselves with no one to recognize that they suffer at the hands of people that are supposed to love and care for them? What happens when we have to engage the black man who explodes from the repression of anger and suffering he's dealt with as a child and a boy to a grown man? See, we don't care about that suffering until it allows us to view him as a perpetrator. We don't study the conditions that give rise to ecological forms of violence. They're not driven by his masculinity, but driven by his trauma. So the study of these things requires us to open our purview of what we think black men are actually going through in life. We find the same case when we look at sexual violence. In the United States, 6.5% of black men experience contact sexual violence, which includes rape, being made to penetrate, sexual coercion, and unwanted sexual contact. This is slightly more than black women who report 5.8% and white women who report 3.6% in the 12-month prevalence. So while women in the United States do report higher lifetime prevalences of rape and sexual coercion than men's made to penetrate violence and sexual coercion generally, the majority of the perpetrators of made to penetrate violence, roughly 78.5%, and of sexual coercion, roughly 81.6%, and unwanted sexual contact against men or women. So when we actually look at the disproportionate rates of women, we're not shocked by this. We expect this kind of victimization to be compounded by socioeconomic deprivation and gender. But when we see that the lifetime reports of black men, or men generally, involve women, we have no explanations. This perpetrator view makes us blind then to the rates of prevalence and victimization that black men suffer. There's no explanation for why black men, in our theories, should suffer such high rates of sexual victimization, because we think that black males are invulnerable to it. See, black male studies is asking questions about what are the conditions of trauma that allow us to get to a point of deviance? What are the circumstances of oppression that create the basis for disengaging the society, or nihilism, as Bell Hooks suggested? What is the kind of suffering that we have that precedes death? These are philosophical and existential questions that previous arguments under black masculinity have failed to address or ask. So what ends up happening is that categories essentialize black male pathologies to a group phenomenon. Despite the evidence, despite the trends, despite the demographic trends and patterns, we formulate black men based on a preconceived notion of them harming other people. But we don't do this to other groups. Because when we talk about lesbian, bisexual violence, even though there are tremendous rates of perpetration, we don't thereby conclude that lesbians and bisexual peoples should be interpreted as violent naturally. We see the same thing with gay and bisexual men. Higher rates of perpetration and victimization. But we don't interpret those groups as being fundamentally dangerous to themselves and others around them. So what is it about the black male that makes violence stick to his concept fundamentally? What is it about the negativity of violence that seems to become endemic to his very identity and character? This is the question that drives black male studies. When I developed black male studies, it was under tremendous duress. There were no positive conversations about black men. No one wanted to track the empirical evidence of black males' political attitudes. No one wanted to discuss the sexual victimization of young black boys. Early sexual debut never became an issue. The concentration on black men 5 or 6 years ago, I think was fair to say, was almost primarily dictated by the extent to which they were toxic. And this conversation involved accusing black men of homophobia, internalized hatred for themselves, the rejection of black women through misogyny and sexism, sexual assault and violence, murder, crime, and a general disregard for every other group that's not them. There were no theorizations within disciplines that entertained the idea that black men were progressive, or that black men could be studied under a different framework besides intersectionality and black feminist thought. Black men have been theorizing multiple masculinities since the late 1970s. And I want the audience to really capture the importance of this. While we celebrate the work of someone like R.W.S. Connell for theories of hegemonic masculinity, subordinate masculinity, and marginalized masculinities, suggesting there was an intervention into masculinity studies and feminist theory by announcing that some men didn't fit the general patterns of a patriarch, black men a decade before dedicated their lives to understanding how the racial capitalist system, poverty, unemployment, and segregation actually pulled them away and distanced them from patriarchy and deviance. So black sociologists were claiming that black men had a different masculinity, that they were in fact family men, that they were interdependent, and that they could not be studied simply by the imitation that people thought they had to white masculine norms. In the 1980s and 90s, black scholars argued that patriarchy needed to be redefined given the level of violence that black men experienced both in the United States, the Caribbean, and in Africa. Dr. Earl Miller introduced the idea of patriarchy as a kinship and endogamic grouping that excluded alien men and produced social systems that were more violent and isolating than seen towards women or any other in-group enclave. Dr. Jim Sedanius, who recently passed, was the William James professor at Harvard that developed the subordinate male target hypothesis, which argued that the most violent and lethal forms of social discrimination targeted out-group males, and that these effects could be seen in criminal justice, education, social upward mobility, interest rates, and negative social capital. And of course, Dr. Anthony Lamel, who showed that black males in the United States are burned not only by racism, but a contradictory system that both feminizes them and hypermasculizes the group in labor participation. What we've done in creating disciplines and the study of black masculinity is actually devoid those conversations of black men and their theoretical contributions. Black men exist as objects of other people's study, the fear that others project on them as a group. And then we say that that's the case of what they are and try to deconstruct or detract from the severity of those claims. But the scientific study of black men require understanding the historical and sociological relationship that hierarchy has to negative social group capital. How black men are marginalized, how black men don't fit within the normative views of masculinity, how black men throughout the Caribbean and through the diaspora have a fundamentally different history than an engagement of replicating patriarchy. And of course, social dominance theory, which says that we can actually test the theoretical lenses that we have about black men. Imagine that, to test something considering black men and then develop a theory. I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce the work of William A. Smith. He told me we'd be watching, so William, I got the best picture I could of you. You look smooth in this one at least, right? But William A. Smith is important because he introduced the idea of black misandry as an analytic idea. And what's important about this is that we have to understand that as intuitive as it may seem, under intersectional analysis just suggests that black men suffer from racism, there is a male component that energizes the amounts of lethal violence that black men experience. So be it police killings and incarceration, as you just saw with sexual vulnerability, domestic abuse and rape are made to penetrate violence. When you talk about sex crimes, or hate crimes, right? Black men are disproportionately targeted. Gay black men are disproportionately targeted than their female counterparts. There's something about the male element that inspires and triggers the kind of gratuitous violence that Afro-pessimists become so obsessed with. And we don't regard this because the object, the population that's harmed are black men and boys, a group that we not only fail to recognize, but actually seem to get rewarded for not recognizing. So Smith's analysis has identified racial microaggressions or racial misandric microaggressions in education and correlatively linked these to the experiences of racial battle fatigue. In the years following Smith's intervention, I then developed anti-black misandry to talk about the phenomena and the specific currents of violence and patterns of dehumanization that target black men in the United States. And I define anti-black misandry as a cumulative assertions of black male inferiority that's due to the errant psychology of lack, dispositions of deviance or hyperpersonality traits like hypersexuality and hypermasculinity, which rationalize the criminalization, phobics, and sanctioning of black male life. Despite these hardships, black men still turn out to be some of the most progressive men that the world has ever known. And this is part of the demand that black male studies makes in challenging our perceptions of black men. If we start with the intuitions of the public, the intuitions of academics, the intuitions of liberal academic theory, black men are left to the wayside, because black males have historically been an object and specter of fear, violence, and sanction. So black male studies develops generalizable theories to explain black male life through evidentiary support and evidence-based analysis that allows us to project and challenge negative theories with positive evidence. So through sociology, phenomenology, ethnography, black male studies seeks to capture black male life as a way to interpret what is lost in death. It doesn't start with death as the object and the obsession of how we study black men and boys. When we actually study black male attitudes, we find that black males have a communal independent sense of manhood, not masculinity. Black men talk about maleness and manhood as the basis of how they understand themselves in the world. This is vastly different from how white men talk about masculinity and the performance and capital that masculinity gains them. So black men are, in fact, the most egalitarian male group in the United States. They not only hold views about women and social equality that surpass most female groups, but are equal to, and in some cases surpass, the egalitarian beliefs of black women concerning gender politics. And it's not only on issues of feminism or women's progressive politics or working outside of the home, it's also in terms of things like homosexuality, queer politics, equal rights, etc. They don't differ from their female counterpart, right? Or at least that's what regression models show. But the idea, now think about that for a moment, but the idea that you have is that somehow you can intuitively assert that black men would be more homophobic. Despite the lethal forces imposing themselves on black males in the United States, black males remain vigilant against dehumanizing acts and are outstanding fathers and family members. So much so that when other black men in their neighborhoods or communities go missing, they step up in the role of social fathers. They take on the intercommunal burden of the oppression and the kinds of disproportionate death and homicide that affect their group by filling in for those who are missing. Findings from Jamal Love about the American National Election Survey found similar results, that when you look at answers to the question between black men and women, if the U.S. would have fewer problems if everybody was treated equally, they're about the same, or whether or not society should ensure equal opportunity to succeed, they're the same as their female counterparts. So ultimately, according to William A. Smith's analysis or study in the late 90s, black men have been found to be just as supportive of their female counterpart in supporting affirmative action programs and college diversity initiatives. So Black Male Studies is trying to launch a massive resocialization. So to combat the mythological origins and socialization of black males as violent and socially regressive and sexually dangerous, educators and policymakers must look at the social determinants of violence, not masculinity or maleness, as the cause of deviance. And I can't highlight this enough. The evidence suggests that it's the ecological determinants that are driving forms of deviance. So higher rates of unemployment, earlier sexual debut, higher rates of child physical abuse. These are the kinds of things that are going to drive how black men interpret the world. Primary educators must emphasize the mythological nature of contemporary masculinity theories and their inapplicability to the black male circumstance. So contrary to the idea that we can simply jump into disciplines, add black boys, and stir, we have to look at how black men and boys actually do not fit contemporary white or Eurocentric theories, and how the evidence shows that those theories are not only limited, but extremely dangerous because they assert certain forms of criminology and cultural deficit that we simply cannot substantiate either by interviewing black men and boys about what they think about themselves or the trends of violence that we find in their neighborhoods. Said differently, if you want to claim that black men and boys are dangerous, but you have all kinds of violence in their neighborhood and everyone else is dangerous too, masculinity is probably not the cause. That's called selection bias. So what we've done is we've rationalized as progressive liberal politics the demonization of this group by all kinds of methodologically suspicious apparatuses. And academic programs must insist on evidence-based and phenomenological research, emphasizing how black males construct and experience this world. This checks interpretive frameworks emphasizing pathology and criminological frameworks that are passing as liberal political ideology, and allows agentic group accounts of research emanating from the group that experiences and can verify the theoretical accounts. Said differently, if you have a theory about black men should be able to say whether or not that theory is accurate or not accurate. Any questions? Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Not a problem.
Yes, sir.
All right. So questions for our, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Tommy Curry,
thank you
for that profound, stirring, informative talk. I'm still taking it in. I'm still thinking through this. But we want to open up the floor. We have several people on Zoom who may have questions as well, so we'll watch the chat there. But anyone in the audience would like to kick us off?
Okay.
I have the mic on this side, and Caroline has one on that side.
Dr. Carey, the GOAT.
Hey, sir, how you doing?
Good to see you in person. There's a lot of things I wanted to ask you about, but I think I would like for you to speak to just looking at the perspective of Black men and our contributions from a healthy perspective. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that, and you touched on this already in the presentation, how so much of our discourse comes out of an expression of one's pain, right? Mm-hmm. So I remember, we talked about this, a lot of academic conferences I've been to, the presentation was literally about, this happened to me when I got raped, this happened to me when my father did this to me. And what happened in those individual experiences has then become, this is a representation of Black men.
Right.
So could you speak to that, and what would a healthy perspective of Black men look like?
I mean, it's difficult because I work with so many victims of sexual violence, and you see the same thing with Black men, right? When Black men are abused by women, our caretakers, they tend to generalize that pain of the group towards the whole group. So the same thing happens to women, right? We know that this is just some of the patterns by which people cope with what they've been through. But we have to understand that is a coping mechanism, and that's a traumatic response to that event. And what we've seen in the academy is the proliferation of these kinds of negative experiences gaining legitimacy from white liberal audiences. Because we need to be very clear. It's not as if Black people are bankrolling these negative endorsements. There are Black people that perform them. But the reason that these things get so much press and so much prestige is because they circulate outside of conversation into popular media and public intellectualism, and that becomes fact, even though there aren't studies to substantiate that. So we have to interrupt that. Black male studies doesn't seek to take away the pain of the victim, or the female victim in that case, but it serves to contextualize it. The same way that if I'm talking to a young boy or a young man who was abused as a young boy, I understand him coping by demonizing certain groups of women or certain caretakers that may have hurt him, but there's context to that pain. And because there's not been allowed any other voices to say, well, look, I understand that trauma and I'm sorry, but how does that serve as the basis of how we should think about Black men? There's been no challenge to this for the last 3 decades. We've had nothing but trauma and hurt and individual incidences of violence, contextualized academic and disciplinary theory, so much so that anybody that challenges those dispositions then becomes the danger. So if you challenge the fact that all Black men are not rapists, are not abusers, are not molesters, you're the sexist, you're the patriarch, you're the misogynist because you're denying groups of people's pain. But we have to understand that there's something really at stake in the humanity of what Black men as a group suffer and go through. So the same way that during genocides and the Holocaust, you saw the same kind of arguments. Jewish men are rapists. Jewish men spread syphilis. Jewish men can't be trusted with women. Jewish men want to doom civilization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same way that Black men are forced to have a front seat at their own academic dehumanization and spectacles. Because we go to conferences and we see people clap and snap when Black men are saying, you're not human, you're violent, you're a monster, you're trash, you're bullet bags, et cetera. So the only healthy response to that is the refutation of those kinds of claims. And what's become the most problematic aspect of this is that any challenge for Black male humanity is seen as taken away from someone else's humanity. So the disagreement that Black men have about how they're being depicted is somehow the liberatory stake that other groups have in their politics. So as Black scholars, we need to start doing some real intellectual work here. How is it that negative conceptualizations of groups, of members of your own group, is necessary to your liberation? There's not a single group of people in the history of the world that's gotten free by demonizing their own people. So then what is the capitalistic and historical relevance that you see for negative ideations about Black men and boys? See, because we know what the evidence says, right? We know that white people, or white liberals at least, tend to support political programs the more distance that they have away from black male problems. So in a very real sense, and this is partly what I think Sylvia Wynter was getting at in No Humans Evolved, the stratification of black class dynamics, from middle class to bourgeois to upper class, et cetera, not only is involved with social mobility and capital acquisition, but also the distance that the middle class and the upper class have from the poor, wretched black male that is thought to be the burden of the society and the doom of civilization. So a healthy response would be black men launching academic and civil challenges against the proliferation of these ideas. And I've always said in black male studies that the refutation of these stereotypes isn't simply about one article, it's about the resocialization of the academic community against these kinds of stereotypes having explanatory force and power. Because they don't explain anything. You saying that a black man hurt you doesn't explain why the black man hurt you. Having a higher incidence of rape or early sexual debut in your community doesn't explain why. Because the onus then says, oh, well, every black man walks around with this psychology of harming other people. But then you look at the victimization rates and you say, well, that means other people also seem to have the same kind of pathology towards these young black boys, given that they're having their first sexual debut between the ages of 9 and 14. So there's something about the status of oppression that we have to start reorienting ourselves toward. And I'll be honest with you, I started thinking about this differently after I visited the Shoah Foundation when I did my fellowship there. Because when you look at the testimony of what Jewish people went through, you see all kind of heinous crimes. You see sexual violence amongst each other. You see men raping women, women, raping, men and boys that they're hiding. You see all kinds of acts. But at no point did the Jewish scholars say that that was endemic to what their people were. Because they said that when you take away civilization, when you put them under violence and the threat of death, it changes what their people were willing to do to survive or enjoy a moment of pleasure knowing they could be killed at any moment. Now think about that. Same problems, same acts of violence, but beyond all that, the major point was we centered the humanity of our people and recognized that the conditions they were put in is not indicative of the inner nature of what they are. But ask yourself if that's how we interpret black people. Do we think that the impoverishment, that the murder, that the trauma, that the violence that we experience, do we see those things as contingent to our own fundamental nature? No. We argue that's what we really are. And see, and this is part of why black male studies is a decolonial methodology. It suggests to us that the sociological conditions of oppression can be seen in any other group in similar circumstances. So you can't make the claim that black masculinity is uniquely responsible for the kind of violence that every other group experiences if you put them in the same conditions of poverty, exposure to violence, etc. And this is something that we've not done because we're not rewarded for thinking about positive concepts of our own people. We're rewarded for demonizing each other and then claiming who deserves more attention and recognition from whites. We're not trying to get at the truth. We're not trying to get at the causes that can be solved through things like policy or public health initiatives. We're not trying to do that. And what Black Male Studies is doing is trying to say we can remedy the problems that you think you have with black boys if you change the conditions that formulate or drive the way that they're living and what they're forced to endure.
We have a question here in the Zoom room. The work you and other black male scholars are doing runs deeply contrary to what many feminists, black feminists, and professors of women and gender studies teach in the United States Academy. What are some suggestions you have on how to do this serious intellectual work that Black Male Studies proposes, and you've kind of talked on this, in the context of the feminist investment of studying black males through the lens of negativity in the U.S. Academy?
That's a great question. It's just a fight. Intellectual traditions sometimes run against each other. And I think that given the kinds of things that I've seen circulated, and I've always been very clear, this is not all black feminists, this is not all black feminist scholarship. I'm constantly trying to nuance the claim. But I think that it's fair to say there are some variations of black feminist scholarship in the academy that do hold extremely toxic and negative views of black men and boys that say things like they're trash, that they're irredeemable, that they should be abolished, that they're bully bags, etc. And I think that those theories are irreconcilable with any notion of black male humanity. And it's incumbent on black male scholars and black male studies scholars to challenge those ideas with evidence and study. Because what's at stake here is not simply the rants that we see on Twitter, but it's the acceptance that these views are actually true and actually shared and actually legitimate. And it's these kinds of things that we have to have a stake in reformulating, because black men and boys are in fact part of this society. So resocialization is a major way for us to gain consciousness and actually develop policy to address the kinds of things that they're dealing with.
Okay, we have 3 questions in the Q&A.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to start with the first one. Okay, I would love to hear about the function of the concept of genre from Winter in your work.
Okay. So I'm a big fan of Sylvia Wynter's work, largely because I like how she explains the move that black power intellectuals and that black arts movement thinkers had in trying to reformulate how black people thought about themselves. And I can't underscore that enough, because what I see Wynter doing is translating a moment of extreme revolutionary potential and hope that black people had in changing what blackness meant into an actual epistemology and process of rethinking what humanity or human actually means for us. And I think while Afro-pessimists have certainly gone down this road as well, the nuance of genre, right? This idea of being able to study black people without the interpretive frameworks and the determinism of Eurocentric theories is something that's fundamentally unique and important. When we talk about studying any group that's been disadvantaged, one of the first moments of any reconciliation, even if you look at apartheid in South Africa or you look at the Holocaust, is the self-determination of the group about what happened to them, right? And this is why I think truth and reconciliation committees are interesting. I don't think they're enough, but at least interesting, because they're marked by a moment of self-determination. What black people do not have is that self-determination intellectually. We're always beholden to the determinism of other people's theories about us. We're forced to write dissertations about how other people think about us, have to refute that, and then we can say what we think later, right? And what that does is it prefigures a kind of intellectual subservience. And I think that's what genre tries to free us of. Genre suggests to us that we can study various types of black oppression and black being and black life and black death and black hope without having to answer for the entailment that categories formulated on Western theories of man have. So you can talk about classism, you can talk about gender, but those are white expectations that develop from antagonism between white men and women and white rich and white poor, working class and poor people. That doesn't mean that those antagonisms are the same amongst black people or any other colonized people. This is why Fanon says that when you look at Marxism, you have to bend it to fit the colonial situation. So I think that, so I think that's the first function of genre, and outgroup males excluded. Well, I mean, look, gender, I mean, this is part of Crenshaw's, I think, indebtedness, right? She's looking at Catherine McKinnon's dominance theory, which is looking at an essential account of woman because you can be raped or victimized as woman and not man. So when you're making those kind of Aristotelian claims about what it means to be woman, outgroup men have to be the perpetrators of that, because you're looking at woman as an object or an oppressed entity of patriarchy. That doesn't allow for something like an Earl Miller account where you're going to get patriarchy as actually involving the suppression and murder of outgroup men as well. So intersectionality, while I think is an interesting concept, doesn't have the empirical evidentiary support that something like social dominance theory does, because social dominance theory is looking at the interaction effects of something like race and sex or race and gender, and then making empirically testable claims about that. As I've said in other essays and work, intersectionality is really ad hoc. It's whatever the speaker says it is at the moment that you question them about it. And while that's fine in terms of a creative extrapolation of how that person interprets the world, it doesn't give us repetitive patterns of social distance and social difference that we can measure that allows us to make actual and fundamental claims about black people.
Thank you. This question, you said that black masculinity theories indicate black men communicate through violence. Mm-hmm. What theory was done about white masculinities and their rape of enslaved black women?
Well, that depends. So if you're looking during the same time period, not much, right? The initial arguments about white masculinity focused on poor masculinity. They were extremely classist. So I'm thinking back to Albert Cohen's book, The Link with Boys in 1955, that tried to explain poor white boys joining gangs. You know, poverty and lower class status was basically the foundation of subculture violence theory, at least in its initial formulation. It only became racialized in the 1960s and 70s when they were trying to explain the higher rates of incident and prevalence of homicide and rape in the black community. But white men generally have been the standard, or at least middle-class white men were the standard, and it was poverty or even single fatherness that led to deviations of that. They were thought to be the norm. Now, we do have black psychologists and Afrocentric psychologists that are going to make arguments about European violence during this period of time. So even like the work of Joseph White, where he's challenging the notion of the black outlaw or the black deviant, that's putting the onus on white men's hierarchical structure leading to violence, are all possible sources for us understanding that. But at least within the subculture violence theory, middle-class white men weren't really engaged. It was primarily about lower-class white men until you get to something like, Susan Brownmiller's work in the mid-70s, where she's trying to extrapolate patriarchy, lower classness, and rape. But even then, she puts black men as a larger threat than white men.
And we have one last question here. What interventionist strategies would you recommend regarding the education of young boys and teens from being miseducated about how they conceptualize themselves?
That's a great question. Listen, there's so many. There's so many. Because the interventions that we're aiming for are basically your re-education. And I can't emphasize that enough. Black male studies is not trying to demonize or detract from other groups' suffering. So what we're trying to do is show the interrelation between the suffering that young black men and boys have and the way that indicates something about the social structure. And that intervention, having black men and boys be kind of the canary in the mine, so to speak, for how the larger racial dynamics play out, is something that's well accepted in war and conflict and genocide studies, but not so much in how we study racism. So if we're educating young black men and boys into a world where we think they have privilege, and we're not talking about the kinds of mental health, physiological, psychological, political consequences they have for being young black males, then we're miseducating them. So our interventions have to be directed at evidentiary and structural accounts of why black men and boys face harsher forms of discrimination, higher levels of lethal violence, higher levels of hate crimes, more forms of implicit and explicit violence, more racial battle fatigue, and how they experience racial misandric aggression. We have to teach black boys how to understand themselves. And one of the things that I do give black feminism credit for is actually resocializing how black women interpret their realities. Black men have the same kind of onus and responsibility because we are woefully miseducated about what actually happens to us and what we're actually vulnerable to. So we have many young black boys, and we found this in the study I did with Dr. Utley, who didn't even recognize that they were victims of sexual assault and rape. But we had a proxy question where he said, if this happened to a young girl, would you think it was rape or sexual assault? And they said yes. So the interventions we have are about creating an awareness about both the external social structure and environment and the ways that they experience different forms of trauma and suffering in their own lives. And I think that that's incumbent on us to do that, because if they don't have awareness of what they're actually going through, they're not going to be able to seek out at least any kind of psychological or mental health services, or even other forms of, or make an announce or make a case for different forms of public health interventions that would help their community and their group.
All right, let's give Dr.
Thank you.
Curl your hand.